Okay, welcome everyone to the launch of the Southeast Power Sector Competitiveness Dashboard. Really appreciate you spending your late morning with us. I realize we still have some folks trickling in, but we're going to go ahead and get started. My name is Jackson Ewing. I'm the Director of Energy and Climate Policy here at the Duke Nicholas Institute for Energy, Environment, and Sustainability, which is where the dashboard is emerging from. And it's my privilege to be the chair for the session here today. We've been working on regional power sector competitiveness here at the Nicholas Institute for over 5 years, and the product that we're going to introduce today is the latest culmination of those efforts that are very much ongoing. So in that spirit, we really welcome your feedback, your questions, your pushback, your critiques, ideas for improvement. While the dashboard is going live today, now it's not set in amber, and we really do look forward to continuing to evolve it, to expand it, to improve it in the months and years to come. I'm going to get out of the way quite soon and hand it over to my colleagues who will take you through a test drive of the dashboard itself. But before doing so, I'm just going to add two brief framing comments. First is that we recognize that competitiveness is a term that leaves lots of room for interpretation. For our purposes, we're defining competitiveness as state policies, regulatory structures, and market agreements that create conditions that can support or hinder consumer and community choice, distributed generation, multi-actor market participation, investment decision-making, and sharing of regional resources. Now, I recognize that that's a lot to digest, and we're going to reveal our thinking about this definition in detail over the course of the next hour. Secondly, we recognize there are some really inherent limitations to the dashboard format. And we've ultimately landed on presenting and evaluating 15 indicators across 3 categories for 12 regional states. And we're going to justify those decisions as we go along, but we also appreciate that there are going to be variables that are underrepresented or missing altogether, that there are going to be indicators that are particularly useful and germane to a given state that might be more negligible or peripheral to another. And we also recognize that in their very nature, dashboards entailing scoring, that scoring inevitably reduces complexity and can obscure nuances. Dashboards are well suited to capturing sometimes the presence of policies, but it's often the case that the uptake of those policies, the effectiveness of them, the ultimate impact that they have cannot be reduced to a simple numerical value. So in response to these challenges and trade-offs, we try to be fair in the methods that we've chosen and thoughtful and deliberate in our approach to offering a repository of data and information that can be accessed, downloaded, manipulated, used in any particular way that any particular user chooses. And so we hope that the dashboard is engaged with that in mind. My colleagues will soon go through in more detail the strategies and tactics that we've used and the outcomes that we've arrived at. I'll just wrap up by saying that I think the heterogeneity of the results that we've realized here really embody the variance that we see across the Southeast on these issues. Even states that scored quite high on a competitiveness metrics in aggregate have scored quite low in certain indicators, and vice versa. Those who have arrived in aggregate towards the bottom of the levels have excelled on competitiveness metrics in other realms. So with that, I'm going to turn over to my colleagues, Trey Gowdy and Eric Parajon, who have been the key engines of this work. After Trey and Eric take you through the dashboard, our Director of Research and Engagement, Dr. Alix Zwane, will provide a few thoughts on our theory of impact here and how we hope the dashboard might be used to make useful contributions. A final point on process is that as Eric and Trey walk us through the dashboard, please don't hesitate to put your questions forward through the Q&A function. For those that are points of clarification or have the need for some real-time interventions, we'll try to handle those either over chat or through my polite interruptions of Trey and Eric as they go along. And for those that are more substantive, we'll collect them for discussion after we wrap up the introduction of the dashboard itself. So with that, Over to you, Trey and Eric.
Great. Thank you, Jackson, and good morning, everybody. Uh, Really excited to launch today's dashboard and to kind of walk through it with my colleague Eric here. We'll be kind of trading places as we walk through some of the key components of the dashboard. So, uh, before kind of diving into some of the rankings and some of the scores and the details of the dashboard, I really want to present our vision for what we're going to be walking through. That the dashboard is set up in a layered approach where we have different ways of viewing the data and the results and policy examples. And we hope that these different views are useful. So we're going to walk through some of those views, starting with the homepage here in the dashboard. And I believe the link to this is also in the chat. So starting here on the homepage, we lead with our headline graphic of the map of the region, which highlights the scores and the definition of competitiveness that Jackson opened with. I won't walk through rank by rank of each of the states here, but invite you to do so on your viewing of the dashboard. But I do want to highlight here, as Jackson teed up, the range of scores that we found across the region, and we really see essentially kind of five tiers. Broadly speaking, across the region in terms of where states fell. We'll note that Virginia was the leading score getter in this, but as we dive into some of the specific categories, there's certainly lots of nuance there. So really, kind of in the first tier, the first three states are Virginia, West Virginia, and Kentucky. The second tier of scores near the top are Arkansas and Louisiana. Sort of in the middle, the middle tier here, which you can see as the shades of blue kind of lighten from dark to lighter shades of green. That middle tier is Mississippi, North Carolina, Florida, and South Carolina. We then move to Georgia and Tennessee in the fourth tier, and then the final tier we have Alabama. And so we just kind of present those as some kind of batches and possibly peer states that if there's a state that you're interested in, those might be states kind of in those tiers, those groupings that may be of interest to look at. Moving down, kind of going another layer into our dashboard. I want to present our scores, but before doing so, I also want to note that we have a detailed methodology, a very transparent process of how we assessed all of our 15 indicators and how we developed our scoring rubric. And so that is available here, available for download, and we hope that that is useful. Again, our kind of goal with looking at the different indicators was to provide a consistent lens for evaluating across states, across some common common means or common policy. So as we kind of move now to the detailed state rankings, what I want to introduce here is not only the overall scores, which were highlighted in the map, but we've also divided the scores of the dashboard into different categories that may be insightful in looking at specific indicators. So again, we have 15 indicators across the dashboard, but we've divided those up into three categories from the consumer category, consumer-facing policies and activities, the structure category. Those are more about the regulatory frameworks of a given state, as well as the regional market category, which is designed to look at uh, independent system operators, regional exchanging of energy, and some related issues. And so what's really interesting about this section here is, yes, you can see again the overall scores, but if you were really interested in, let's say, the consumer-facing policies, you can sort this table and look at this data, and you can see, well, what states had the leading scores in that given category. And so there are different ways to look at this table and this data, and ultimately you could also download this and look at those pieces in detail. We'll talk about this a little bit more later, but also wanted to highlight that the detailed scores of all the 15 indicators, those are available in a different table, and it's also interactive in this way where you can download the data and uh, interact with the different columns and sort if there's one that is of particular interest. So with that, I'm going to now turn it over to Eric as we dive into some of the states.
Excellent. Thanks, Trey. So we're going to start with kind of a dive into the sort of highest tier of competitiveness state, which was Virginia in our Southeast sample. And as Trey mentioned, we really tried to go with this kind of layered approach where depending on the level of detail that you wanted in the dashboard, you could kind of see the overall rankings on the homepage and then dive into sort of a deeper kind of more in-depth look at specific states. And so here you can see for Virginia, again, the kind of rank in the Southeast is repeated. As I said, Virginia is kind of the highest the kind of highest tier of competitiveness in the region. We start with a kind of a clear comparison to the other states in the region. So you can see that Virginia achieved about 60% of the total possible points across our 15 indicators, which is significantly higher than the mean of about 43% of the total points. So again, just adding a kind of point of comparison to other states in the region. As you scroll down, we really start to unfold, a bit more of a detailed perspective on the scores. So here we're giving you the actual scores that Virginia achieved across these 15 indicators, broken up by those categories that Trey mentioned, with consumer at the top, moving to structure in the middle, and then regional market at the bottom. And we're enabling kind of a quick comparison to the mean values for the Southeast states. So you can really see at a glance that Virginia in particular is really kind of excelling across a number of these categories. So for example, the market participation indicator in the regional market category, Virginia gets full credit, which is far above the regional means. This is an area that they're really excelling in at kind of achieving this competitiveness. We go into much more detail about how these points were scored in the methodology, as Trey mentioned. But in this case, with Virginia, nearly fully participating in the PJM wholesale market, they receive the full credit, the full point value for that particular indicator. However, you can see, as Jackson mentioned, that there's fairly significant heterogeneity across the state. So even though Virginia is again the highest competitiveness state in our sample, you can see there's some indicators where they did less well than the regional mean. So for example, those two concentration indicators in the middle in the structure category, you can see there's fairly significant kind of areas for improvement, even in these states where competitiveness tends to be higher than the regional mean. So for example, we can see that the utility market in Virginia is highly concentrated and in fact below the regional mean. So if we scroll down a little bit past this table, you can see we start to get into what we're terming as kind of the strengths and opportunities section. And each state has these broken down. And what these are qualitative summaries of the scores with clear sourcing for where the data came from, and a kind of an explainer of how the points were determined. So again, here you can see repeated that Virginia achieved high scores in market participation because of their participation in PJM. However, if you go to maybe one of the opportunities section, you can see again, areas for improvement. So I'll talk kind of briefly about the generation concentration indicator that I mentioned before, which is one that we're quite excited about. So in kind of our exploration of indicators to include, we came across a report from the EPA from 2010 that talked about this tactic for measuring concentration of generation within a state using the Herfindahl-Hirschman index, the HHI index. And this is a concept that comes from antitrust legislation. So it comes from the Department of Justice, which you can see linked in the source tab. And essentially, for each given state, we calculated the generation-based market shares as each utility's total nameplate capacity in a state divided by that state's total nameplate capacity across generation units. And what this resulted in is one value for each state, where higher values of HHI indicate fewer owners of generation, so kind of more concentration and thus less competition. So for the case of Virginia, their HHI score exceeded the 1800 threshold, again, coming from the DOJ, which indicates a highly concentrated market. So this is just sort of a brief summary of where these scores came from for each of the states for each of the indicators, alongside the kind of sourcing. So you can check out the data for yourself.
Hey,
And all these,
Eric,
sure,
sorry, I didn't want to interrupt you while you were in HHI mode. I thought that would be too derailing for any of us, but I do want to slow you down just for a
sure,
moment, please, to have you weigh in on Howard's question here. I know
sure.
you've alluded to market participation already, but this is a question I'm unsurprised to see. How do we think about the impact of a state being part of an ISO or RTO? And in our case, I think we need to bring up the degree to which they are a part of
Mhm.
those sorts of markets versus being in a vertically integrated market. Within this larger context, how can we best explain how that impact is represented in the dashboard?
Sure. So that's certainly, a fairly significant element of competitiveness and kind of competition writ large. So this was something that we, were really kind of focused on evaluating. So we have the market participation indicator, which is kind of the clearest, quantitative assessment of how the degree to which a state is participating in a regional market. And then we also have two other indicators in that market category, that assess kind of representation. So the role of civil society participation in a wholesale market. So are there kind of third party entities that have a role in kind of the governing of the regional market? Then we have an indicator for capturing the state authority role in the wholesale market. So kind of the question on sort of relative value that we're placing on a wholesale market. So you can see we have three indicators out of the 15 that are based, around kind of RTO ISO participation. So this is something that was fairly significant to us. But I think this is also an opportunity to note that these indicators are not weighted. So this was something that we really had a lot of kind of internal debate on. And I think we settled on, not really wanting to put kind of our finger on the scale, just presenting the data unweighted. Every indicator is kind of counted the same across the categories. Of course, as Trey mentioned, users can download the data, and apply weights themselves, or remove indicators that they may think are kind of less relevant to their state context. But we wanted to give kind of the clearest picture possible across these indicators.
And I think that's a great point to jump over and look at some of the additional views where you can compare indicators across all of the states. And then I'll also highlight an additional state and highlight some of the additional features that are present on all of the state pages. So this is accessible on the home page, but also on each of the state pages. You can click here to access all of the details of the indicator scores across all of the states here. So 15 indicators, 12 states. We basically have 180 data points here. So lots of room to explore and to dive in to these data. So let's take a look at one additional indicator as an example. The ability for a commercial or industrial customer to choose their electricity supplier at the retail level. That's available here. And on a quick view, you can see there are two states that get partial scores for that metric. So we can sort this table from high to low or low to high. And here we can see that Georgia and Virginia have some level of retail choice for commercial and industrial consumers. And quick detail as to why we're assigning that a half point versus a point for these states. There are some restrictions around the number of times that customer can make that selection, or sizing restrictions based on the amount of demand. So it's not complete access. There are some restrictions there. So that's where we've kind of assigned a partial score. So here, this is a place where we could dive into Georgia just as our second and final state example, and to explore that piece a little bit more. So we can again dive in and look at as the example commercial and industrial retail choice. You can see here Georgia gets a half point out of one, and that is higher than the regional mean. If you wanted to explore some of those details further for that CNI choice. We can go here to intermediate score since it's a half point. We've assigned it an intermediate score. And so for Georgia, again, for example, there's one-time choice available for commercial and industrial customers with demand over 900 kilowatts. Um, I think this is
Trey,
yeah, please.
oh, sorry. It seems like there's no elegant way for me to interrupt you guys, despite my best efforts here. Apologies for that. I know that many folks in the virtual room here have questions similar to that posted here by Alan, which have to do with the various different factors in the energy system that we might not capture in our competitiveness indicators. In Alan's case, he's asking about electricity price, cost of electricity as a category or indicator. Can you please say and or show how we do capture some of those contextual variables and give some background into our thinking about why they fit there and not necessarily always in a particular indicator?
Absolutely. So I'll start first on the why. So yes, electricity prices are an important component to the sector, but through the lens of competitiveness, we do view that as more of an impact, possibly, but we didn't want to make a direct causal link between competitiveness solely and electricity prices. And so we recognize there are many factors related to how electricity prices um, are are calculated and are provided to consumers. And so through the strict lens of just competitiveness, we did not include it as a means for scoring, but because it is such an important component here, we do have electricity prices primarily for residential customers available across all of the states. It's at the bottom of this page, but I'll also scroll to the top just to highlight one feature we haven't shown yet is we have bookmarks throughout each of the state pages where if you were just interested in diving into some of those additional contextual data around the conditions of electricity prices or maybe reliability, the amount of energy consumed in a state that is electricity, as well as some of the details of the makeup of that state's grid. We have that available on each of the state pages. And so, just as an example, we can see here on the Georgia page that the average residential monthly bill for just electricity is $151. And you can compare that to the national and regional averages with the additional context of uh, how electrified is the state as one component there, as well as how does that compare as a percentage of income across the state. So that data is available, and I'll take a quick moment to navigate to this summary table for the entire region. So again, here, this does not factor into the specific scoring around competitiveness, but we present this and other data across the dashboard as important context and uh, relevant information that likely would be informative here. So again, these tables are interactive. You can download this data here through the Get the Data button. So lots of potential to explore those data. I'm going to turn it back to Eric now to also highlight a key component of the dashboard, a tool that will allow a user to simulate possible changes in policy and how that could translate in different scores related to our methodology. So I will turn it back to Eric.
Thanks, Trey. Yeah, so as Trey mentioned, this is a part of the dashboard that I'm, kind of particularly excited about. And so this is an application powered by our Shiny. And as Trey mentioned, what this tool will allow folks to do is to basically test kind of policy, what if scenarios and dynamically see how the scores change if a specific policy or combination of policies is changed. So what you're seeing right now is the scores for Alabama as we scored them, in kind of the real world context. And if we kind of go to the select a state tab, you can select any of the states that you're interested in. We'll explore the Georgia state again. So you can see, the scores changed to the Georgia score, which, again, was ranked 10th out of 12 Southeast states. However, if we were interested in, as Trey mentioned, this kind of CNI choice indicator, there's some kind of restrictions on the indicator. They scored a 0 0.5, kind of half credit on that indicator. What if those restrictions were to change? So you can change that slider from 0 0.5 to 1, and you can see that these scores dynamically update. You can see that this kind of a one change, it was able to move Georgia's rank from 10th to 9th out of the southeastern states. So again, really excited about this tool. It's kind of a nice sort of interactive feature for folks to play around with. As Trey mentioned, with this kind of nested approach, this is really for those who kind of want to get in the sort of wonky weeds of the data and play around with the different features. We also wanted this to be, at least a little bit kind of self-contained to an extent. So if you scroll down to the indicators details, we have a very sort of simplified, scoring criteria with a short description for each of the indicators across the various categories. Basically, just sort of repeating a lot of the information that's in the methodology. So if you're, really kind of in the weeds of playing around with this tool, you can see exactly what's going on with the scoring. And again, this is an area where obviously all of the dashboard, we're going to be kind of focusing on iterating and improving over time. But just due to the nature of this being, this kind of contained web app, this is something that we're actively in development for. We're looking at adding capabilities and options, moving into the early part of next year. Welcome feedback on this particular tool. One kind of feature that we're interested in, and go back to my point about how currently the data is unweighted, as if this would be a place to add, an option for folks that maybe if you're looking at a state where, a regional market is just not something that your state is interested in, you could drop, kind of the relative weight of that category, bump up the consumer category, and again, kind of dynamically see how those scores would evolve. So yeah, something that we're super, super excited about to continue to iterate over time.
Thanks, Eric. I'm going to jump in here because we do have two questions that really speak to where you've landed there. I know you were talking about updating the interactive tool, but the questions really speak to updating the data that underpins the indicators themselves. So, Trey, could you get us started on that, on kind of our sustainability plan for this data? Maybe say a few things beyond what we've already presented on the nature of how we've collected the data, how we manage it, things of that nature.
Absolutely. So our process with this has been to focus on the most recent years of data that we had access to, open data. And so it's our goal to continue to update that. So for the consumer conditions data, so the electricity price data, percentage of electricity or energy that is electricity in a state. Those are data that are reliably updated annually, and so that's something that we would expect to update as those are updated, as well as on the indicators. Some of these we don't expect many of these policies necessary to change from year to year, but there are metrics that could be regularly rerun and updated. And so across the dashboard, we do envision another iteration of this into 2026, updating to again the most most recent data that's available, as well as potentially additional indicators as we update our processes. I'll just close
Thanks.
here. Yeah.
Sorry, go ahead, Trey, please.
Oh, please. Thank you. I'll just close here on the homepage for anybody that may have missed this earlier, or also just to as a reminder. Uh, the homepage is a place where you can access all of the individual state pages, and again, our process, our methodology is linked to there, and that features not only our detailed process and approach for each of the indicators, but also definitions for what we mean when we're discussing third-party power purchase agreements or any of the indicators, literature on how each indicator is relevant to competitiveness, as well as we have a repository of uh, different dashboards that have explored this question. And so we see our dashboard as one just to complement this existing space. And so with that, I'll close on the dashboard share, and happy to dive in.
Yeah, thanks much, Trey and Eric. I'll shortly turn it over to Alix for some additional thoughts on our theory of change and application here. Before doing so, though, I do want to address an additional question that's been posed, as well as to encourage others to go ahead and put your questions in the Q&A function for our discussion upcoming. And that is this question about the Southeast comparative place relative to other regions in the country. The questioner here insightfully points out that while we have Virginia, showing something of a gold standard here, based in part on PJM participation, it would comparatively look differently if it were being shown alongside other PJM states. So on that, we do have different areas in the dashboard that do show national averages, for example, on some things like electricity costs, so on and so forth. But perhaps more importantly, we focus on the Southeast in part because of the particulars of the competitiveness equation in this region of the country, and the continuum of competition that we see as both existing and being part of the art of the possible moving forward in unique ways that are perhaps different than regions that have more market participation currently. With that in mind, and we won't dwell on this too much today because it's still certainly at very early stages. One of the next phases of the project will be to create a similar dashboard approach to Western states, and to try to evaluate the competitiveness continuum in that context in a similar way tactically to what we've shown here today, but one that will certainly have some different specifics because of the differences between the Southeast and the Western contexts. So with that, I'll pass to you, Alix, and then we can get further into the discussion. Over to you.
Great. Thank you so much, Jackson. And thank you to Trey and Eric for your ably navigating both interruptions and the flow of the presentation. Great questions, and from the audience here, really engaging with exactly the kind of things we've grappled with in creating this. Is the right unit of analysis the utility, the parent company, the state? How do you deal with overlapping markets, et cetera? And so we welcome your input and as you explore this data and we think about how to take this forward. As my colleagues have said, we will be at Duke continuing to update this dashboard on an annual basis and continuing to put color around the data itself as well. That really is part of what we hope is the theory of change of this tool. We were seeking in creating this dashboard to get to, the sufficient statistics to capture the essential nature of the competitiveness continuum. Of course, you could go into more granular detail, or you could have lifted it up a little bit higher. We're trying to get a Goldilocks solution here, in part because we want it to be easy to update and we want it to be really accessible and easy to understand, even for those potential users who are not deeply embedded in the energy or the utility industry. We hope that this is a tool, yes, for advocates, whether that's environment, or consumer choice. But we also hope it's a tool for politicians and their staff. And we hope it's a tool ultimately also for utilities and the larger stakeholders to think about what is possible, what lessons could be learned from colleagues in other states. And when making choices, what doors are sort of halfway open and ready to be knocked upon that maybe you don't necessarily know for yourself. We also hope this is kind of a one-stop shop for at least an initial pass. If you want to learn some information, we've made your life a little bit easier. And then we can all collectively have a more fluid, more fluent conversation about what's an extremely live, obviously, issue in both our region here in the Southeast and nationally. I know we didn't touch on it so much here, but I think probably everybody on this call knows we just had a series of off-cycle elections in which the cost of electricity and the nature of electricity markets were really central to those conversations. This is our contribution now to those ongoing conversations. And yes, we hope that this data remains sufficiently live and alive that it's a useful tool going forward as well. I'll just end by saying, as Jackson began, that we're open to feedback. This is a dynamic tool. Not only will we be able to update it for the Southeast, we'll be turning to other regions as well. And we look forward to continuing the conversation here at the Nicholas Institute. Thank you all.
Thanks much, Alix. I want to start with a question here from Alan, who I think has been spying on some of our internal meetings, given the things that he's bringing up are really core to what we've been grappling with. The issue of provider service areas that do not match up with state boundaries. This is something that we've experimented with different approaches to and really take seriously as kind of an inflection point in some ways in the approaches that we ultimately take. Trey or Eric, either one or both, please unpack our thinking a bit on that and how we kind of recognize that as a challenge and what we've done about it.
Yes, I can kind of address a first component of this and then toss it to Eric. One additional piece that I didn't note in the walkthrough of the dashboard is we do highlight the top 5 utilities by retail sales in a given state, and so providing a sense of what percentage of market share do those utilities in that given state have, as just one additional component here. To the larger question, yes, we did find that kind of looking at data through a state lens did prove to be difficult, particularly in evaluating some of the regional market category indicators. We had to customize some of the analysis and stitch together a few different data sets to arrive at state views. And so we think just providing that in and of itself, some of those percentage values of what percentage of customers in a given state are within an RTO, because in some states it's not 100% and it's not 0, it's somewhere in between. So just providing those percentages, regardless of how we score that, we see that as a novel contribution. I'll toss it to Eric on some of the other data components there.
Yeah, I mean, I would just echo Trey that and Jackson that this was really kind of one of the key data challenges is oftentimes this data is kind of aggregated, across the region or across kind of the utility or across the RTO. And so I think that we had to, like Trey said, be kind of creative with some of our data sources. Others were quite kind of set for the challenge. So like the EIA 860 data was quite nice at sort of attributing generation ownership at a state level and things like that. And then to Trey's point about the kind of RTO question, obviously, some states are in multiple markets, and we for some of these states presented maybe a bit more of a complex calculation. So for the states that were in multiple markets, their score was a weighted average of those proportional to the customer counts. And so that was kind of the way that we captured some of this nuance.
Thanks, Eric. I think that answer begins to start to address some of the question on Virginia that begins with Virginia's participation in the ISO PJM, and asking whether our study evaluates capacity utilization, both in terms of generation and in wires as a competitiveness factor, forms of industrial commercial density, including data centers, system capacity, population density in areas served. We do weigh in on that. I think Trey would be the most well-placed to give some broad answers there. Thanks.
Sure. Yeah. Happy to chime in there. And I think we touch a little bit on interconnection standards or guidelines or the lack thereof in a state. That's not exactly the question, but I do want to mention that one as well. I think some of the items in that in this question, I think could be possible future indicators that could be worth exploring. I think related to Virginia being the top ranked state. Yes, it is the top ranked state in our scoring, but I will also note it and no state receives 100% score. So they're definitely through the lens of how we're evaluating competitiveness. There are areas that we've identified as potential for adjustment. So I think that's an important point to note too.
Yeah, thanks, Trey. Again, I think we have something of a parallel comment slash question on some contractual issues around competitive transmission, and what may have been missed there in our current approach. The questioner here, Howard, makes the very correct point that one of the greatest impacts on costs and competitiveness comes from the capabilities of transmission and distribution in particular, competitive transmission being a potential solution there. Are there any ideas among our group here about how we might try to capture that into the future? And I realize I'm putting us on the spot, but that's why we're doing the event, is to get great ideas like this. Any comment?
I'll jump in quickly. We were really interested in this process of evaluating as just one component of that question, the interconnection queue, really kind of the speed of which projects can get online. But we found that the open data from our kind of first review of that was some data quality issues with that, where we ultimately decided not to evaluate the duration of a queue in a state. But I could see metrics like that, where kind of measuring real time conditions as additional enhancements to this dashboard. We've kind of as this first version, a lot of the focus has been kind of on, as Jackson teed up, kind of the presence of policy. We do have some kind of metrics measuring market characteristics like the generation and customer concentration. But certainly those are areas where we would like to explore further, measuring more kind of real-time conditions.
Yeah, thanks, Trey. I'm going to add to that briefly. Howard, I think you get to, in many ways, some of our ambitions for next phases for the dashboard in the Southeast and future dashboard efforts we make elsewhere, in that now we've kept very intentionally pretty specific guardrails on how we're thinking about competitiveness, and we've tried to supplement that with some contextual information that is relevant, but it is not perhaps factored in the same way that we do for the indicators. There's of course, a broader way to look at competitiveness that speaks to the relative commercial competitiveness of a state for business, industry, and residential purposes vis-a-vis their power sectors. And that's not really what we're attempting to capture here, but we acknowledge its relevance. And so there, we could get into things like what Trey mentions on measuring interconnection queue dynamics and policies. We could even go further into measuring levels of public support and opposition for new build of generation, transmission, and distribution. We could get into permitting lag times and processes, et cetera, et cetera. All of those are kind of outside our scope now, but are things that we're actively considering that I hope are at least adjacent to the question that you're asking there. Eric, I want to turn to you on Min's question here. Sorry, I want to get it right. It just moved on me a little bit. And I want to have you take kind of the final part of the question here on the market concentration variable that Min brings up. Yeah, we do not grapple explicitly with data centers in this dashboard. We have a whole program of work here at Duke that orients around data center flexibility, grid flexibility, to try to meet data center demand, and we do have the potential for growing intersections between that work and what we're presenting here today. However, we have been fairly deliberate in how we've tried to approach issues of customer concentration. So can you give some insights into our approach there? You're muted.
Thank you. The customer concentration indicator is set up quite similarly to the generation indicator. And again, this is something that I think we are quite excited to kind of port this sort of DOJ antitrust language into a new sort of frontier of usage. And I think the questioners kind of comment at the end, potentially sort of speculating on sort of the concentration within Virginia is spot on. So as I mentioned in kind of the overview of scoring, Virginia is one of the most kind of concentrated states, both in terms of customer concentration and generation concentration. And one of the reasons that we wanted to sort of pair these two variables is that wasn't always the case. Some states were higher, more concentrated in one variable and less concentrated in the other. But for Virginia, they did track quite closely. And again, as kind of the comment raised, that's sort of due to the market power of Dominion, for sure.
Yeah, thanks, Eric. Trey, I want to steer a big tent question to you, but before doing so, I'm just going to weigh in on Joseph's question here about factors that influence electricity prices but are not directly included in the competitiveness indicators. This probably won't be a complete or necessarily satisfying answer, but I will say that we aren't always trying to draw direct causal lines here between a given contextual factor or competitiveness indicator and its price outcomes. When we present the price levels for a given state, we do so alongside the sorts of variables around some of the customer concentration things that Eric's brought up, but also overall energy mix, et cetera, percentage of household budgets that are steered towards electricity, not just electricity price itself. But we're not necessarily, in fact, let me remove necessarily, we're not saying that that there are particular kinds of causal relationships among those things. I think that would be taking a step beyond what we've actually been able to or set out to support here. So I think that in a sense, we're not really seeking to show that discrete impact from one variable to another, but we do present a lot of evidence that can show the correlations between different factors and what the price outcomes ultimately are, and encourage users to dig deeper on the variables and indicators that they're most interested in to that end, and use the embedded data and methods that we have in the dashboard to do so. Trey, the bigger tent question here is a huge one. This is, again, one that we've grappled with a lot internally. why is the dashboard focused on policy presence? I don't necessarily want to say versus the implementation of policy, because we do try to capture that where we can. But can you say something about the limitations of capturing implementation of policy and how we've attempted to kind of find our best way through in this respect?
Yeah, so I think there's a two-part answer here. First, it's a lot of it is just data availability. What open data are available that could allow comparisons across utilities in a given state and then consistently across states in the region. So that can often be a limiting factor. In addition to that, there in the way that we measure policies at this stage, we do measure whether or not there are certain restrictions, and those are ways that we try to quantify in some ways in a simple framing, the availability of access of a policy, say net metering, for example, what amount of restrictions or what is the aggregated capacity in a state, what level is that at? And so if that's higher or lower across states, we see that as having more or less access comparing across states. In terms of measuring implementation, if we were to take, for example, the uptake of, let's say, green tariffs, and if we had the ability to compare if a state's customers in a certain customer segment, if 2% opted into a green tariff versus 10% versus 90%, there may be lots of different factors as to why those customers are opting into those programs. And certainly those programs may be designed differently across states. At that point, it's sort of we've made the decision not to draw lines on implementation because we're coming again from the framing of generally the availability to make these decisions, the opportunity to opt in or to allow additional actors into the space versus drawing a line of 2% versus 5 or 10% is more or less enabling competitiveness in the space.
I would just
Yeah,
add quickly
thank
to
you.
that
Oh, please, Eric.
sorry, I would just add quickly to that I think this is an area that we can really engage in some of our upcoming papers. That kind of you mentioned at the onset, Jackson, that there's sort of this delicate balance between the kind of the wanting, desiring sort of parsimoniousness of the dashboard, and ensuring kind of nuance doesn't get lost. And I think in kind of a longer form paper, that's somewhere that we can really dive into this kind of key question of implementation of the policies itself.
Yeah, thanks, Eric. And that's not hypothetical. That paper, papers of that nature are very much in the works, and we expect publication of a large paper on regional competitiveness that draws on the dashboard, but that does precisely what Eric has just mentioned on trying to add nuance to come out during Q1 of 2026. I have a question here. I'll open to the group, certainly including you, Alix, and maybe we'll broaden it out a little bit here beyond just the particular issue that the questioner brings up on major storms. But this is one that I don't believe we've given much attention to. And so, again, it's a great benefit to us to have a crowd like this that can give us these sorts of ideas. But related to the themes of additional future considerations, could we look at the impact of major storms or other disruptive events on the distribution system? Vintage is a great call, major storms notwithstanding, in terms of the need for reconstruction, reinvestment, potentially reconductoring new uses for modernizing existing infrastructure versus building new, et cetera. What are some of our ambitions to your perspective moving forward? Let's start with you there, Trey, and move along.
I think I'll start with just noting we do have some reliability metrics in the consumer conditions piece. So that is a place where we can compare both the number of outage minutes, including and excluding major event days such as storms. So we do provide those metrics and also allow comparison to national averages. I think in terms of quantifying an investment, I think we are hungry for seeking out open data that we could analyze further. So I would say we just definitely are open to any suggestions of data that may exist on those topics, even if that requires, again, kind of stitching together a few different data sets. That's something we're interested in doing, and I think that's clearly in the Southeast. That's a very important topic.
Thanks, Trey. Let's give Alix last word, but first, Eric, do you have anything you'd like to add there?
Yeah, I mean, I think I would echo Trey that this is something that we're definitely interested in. I think there's also kind of a place, to go back to Trey's discussion of kind of the interconnection standards. I think one of the components that we were interested in came out of an NREL study that looked at kind of the idea of lowering soft costs through having kind of very clear interconnection standards that basically sort of reduce, sort of overly complex or unclear requirements for interconnection. And so I think this is a variable that we're interested in. Definitely moving forward. I think it's just kind of finding the right data set that we can use.
Thanks.
Yeah, thanks. I think this is actually a really nice place to end because we started our conversation here around, well, how come electricity prices are not in this index? Isn't that the ultimate measure of competition in markets? And I think one of the things that this question helps us really surface is that prices are not the only thing that we care about in electricity markets. We care about resilience. We care about reliability. And we care about environmental outcomes in both. So it's both like on both sides of the demand and supply equation. And so a natural next step is to say, well, what is the relationship between competitiveness and these other ultimate outcomes of interest, whether it's consumer welfare or well-being or environmental outcomes? And so there's like many rich veins to mine here to build on this dashboard and the work that we've done so far. So we hope that, as I said earlier, that this is a tool that in and of itself is useful for driving better and more fluent conversations, but it's also definitely an input into exploring some of these other outcomes that we all collectively care about. So we really look forward to continuing the conversation with all of you.
Thanks so much, Alix. It's a perfect place to end. Before we do so, I just have a couple of quick thank yous to make. First is that we have a team of students working with us on this project. I particularly want to acknowledge Ben Weintraut and Manjiri Deshmukh, who have been instrumental to both the work to date and will be into the future. And give a particular thanks to the Arthur M. Blank Family Foundation, who have both provided support, but even more importantly, been a true thought partner in the construction of this dashboard and thinking through what its potential import can be for the sector throughout the region and beyond. And we wouldn't be doing this work without that partnership. So thank you to them, and thank you to all of you for joining. Please do not hesitate to reach out to us if you want to take this conversation forward in any way. And we hope that you'll pass along the dashboard to anyone who you think might gain some value from it. With that, I'll sign off, and until next time.